The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is brought to you by Higher Gravity, a craft beer bar located in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the North Side and Blue Ash neighborhoods. And I don't know about you, Mike, but this is my go-to bar. It's my walking distance bar. It's the best selection of beer in the city bar. It is the Mug Club bar. It is the best draft selection bar. It's the best to-go beer bar, and frankly, the best bartender's bar.
I love the one in Northside because it is a fantastic place. There is a massive amount of beers on tap, a great bottle selection. I love it, man. Hard to find a place that still really loves beer, and they do it.
And it's for that reason, we'll see you there. We'll be at the bar.
We'll be at the bar.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast. My name is Brett Coleman Baker, owner and brewer at Urban Artifact in Cincinnati, Ohio. And like every single Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast, I'm here with the one, the only, the unshakable.
Like the herpes.
Michael Morgan. Mike, how are you today, you wonderful STD?
I wish that's the first time I've been called that. I'm fantastic, brother. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Cheers.
You're like a disease is something that it's mostly women that have said that.
I mean, I'm not surprised by any of that. Not only do we have great beers in our hands and are finally drinking at the end of a long day, we are talking to a legend.
A legend on the horn.
In beer today.
Do they still say on the horn?
I don't even know what that means. On what horn? Cow's horn? Unicorn horn?
On the line, on the phone. It's something. I think it dates. Let's move on.
Well, not only did he found Zymurgy Magazine, which is all about making beer, he started the American Homebrewers Association. He started the Craft Brewers Association. He started the Great American Beer Festival, which was the first of its kind in this country. He wrote The Complete Joy of Homebrewing. The man is a legend, and if you haven't guessed by now, it's Charlie Papazian.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of those things seem like common sense these days. I mean, the idea of a beer festival, there are beer festivals everywhere all the time now. He started the very first one. This whole concept of bringing breweries from across the United States together, craft breweries, in one place, and to create this sense of community around a beer festival, around...
So something that shouldn't be understated is the importance of the Great American Beer Festival.
Right.
And I know if you're not big into beer and you're just a casual consumer, you probably don't understand what this is, what it means, or you've never been to it. But really, it's the largest beer festival in America every year. It's been going on for 30 years now.
Largest because it was the first.
And it is the premier beer competition in the country. If you win a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival as a pro brewer, like that's it. Hang it up. You have just hit a career resume goal that so few brewers will ever hit.
Like the Olympics of beer.
That's a good way to put it. That's exactly what it is. And not only that is it the Olympics of beer for the professionals, it's the Olympics of the beer for those who go to enjoy it. There is 1,000 breweries that are there pouring beers, multiple beers. So there's thousands of beers there for you to try.
Also, you know, the joy of homebrewing, that wasn't just a homebrewing book. That was the one. I mean, it was the very first guide in America to teach people how to homebrew.
Well, there's a reason people call it the homebrewing Bible.
Yeah. Because it is.
It's exactly what it is. And I mean, I can't wait to hear the story about how he was able to accomplish all that. And on that note, I mean, we should just get right to it. Mr. Papazian, how are you?
I'm doing great and glad to be on the line with you and talking beer, one of my favorite topics.
Do you have a preferred title or what you would like us to call you?
Well, Charlie. Charlie.
Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
We wanted to ask because we thought, you know, Emperor of Homebrew might be, more appropriate.
Guru of brew. I've been called all kinds of things.
I have two, but most of them are derogatory. So,
Charlie, when we look at all of your accomplishments and everything you've done for beer, for home brewing, for the drinker and the brewer alike in this country. I mean, it's pretty apt that people give you the title of the Johnny Appleseed of beer. But you could argue it is an extremely deserved title, but it might be more accurate to say that you're more like a happy general in a benevolent revolution.
Well, when we got rolling with this idea of home brewing and sharing what we were learning, we didn't have a revolution in mind. We were just so damn frustrated with the choices that we had. And we began enjoying our own homebrew, and we loved the company of others who were kind of struggling to seek and find better beer, which turned to making our own. So it was all rooted in our just passion to accomplish something and please ourselves with finding and drinking better beer, and then sharing that information with each other, which is the kind of the foundation that has stayed the course as far as communicating and sharing and collaboration. We call it collaboration these days, but back in those days, we were just trying to learn and share what we learned and move forward.
Very few people are able to take a passion and turn it into a career. Fewer still are able to keep that career and that passion alive and not let it become a job. Yet, Charlie, after all these years and all these things you've accomplished, you seem as passionate as ever. How have you been able to keep it up?
Yeah, it's last year was my 50th year of brewing beer.
Goodness.
So I'm in my 51st year now. So 1970 was the year I started. And looking back, we can talk about revolutions, and in this day and age, you might even not use the word revolution, but disruptors. But we weren't keyed into trying to put ourselves in any spotlight. But certainly the spotlight began to shine on us immediately. When I was teaching my beer making classes in my home regularly throughout the year, there were people that were spotlighting us. It was illegal to make beer at home, but yet the television cameras would come by and the news pieces were being made and the interviews in newspapers and magazines were happening. Did I have any fear? No, I didn't have any fear, because I figured, well, if I got busted, that would probably be the best thing to happen as far as making people aware of what we were doing and why. But yeah, there were people, there were importers, there were distributors, there were retailers that were local that were, had to see what this was all about, and they drop in and just see the people that were interested in better beer, and it flabbergasted them, because it wasn't your normal, typical, stereotypical beer drinker. It was men and women that were genuinely interested in learning how to make beer and why beer tasted the way it did, or could. And for a few hours, we gathered weekly and we talked about beer, and to distributors and other brewers and retailers and importers, when they came in and watched the dynamics, they were just flabbergasted, let alone that, half the people in my class were usually women. They'd never seen anything like that before. People hanging around, drinking beer and talking about beer.
It's interesting because we talk a lot about the fact that the modern craft industry is really dominated by a lot of white guys with beards. So why do you think it was that about half of your early classes were women?
Yeah, I think women were interested in making beer because they wanted to like beer, but they couldn't. They
You mean they couldn't just because it sucked?
Yeah. I won't say that, but they couldn't because you couldn't find anything that tasted diverse. The diversity wasn't there. So if you didn't like light, slightly bitter, bubbly yellow beer, you didn't have any other choice. So you drank wine or cocktails. But once they started tasting pale ales and stouts and porters, which was, the mainstay of those days as home brewers. And then Belgians came along, and then we were experimenting with fruit and spices. Wow. I mean, the whole world opened up to all of us, men and women. And sometimes our extremism got the better of us, and it didn't turn out so good, but mostly it did.
God, isn't that the real fun of it, though? Just literally being able to take things to the extreme, and it not having to worry about it selling, and not having to worry about if this is going to please X or Y palate, and just doing it for your own curiosity's sake. It's just, I love it.
Yeah, I think that's still today, that's the core foundation of the innovation and home brewers and very small brewers, breweries that are like less than 5,000 barrels, which the majority of brewers in this country are less than 5,000, let alone probably less than 1,000 barrels a year.
Yeah.
And being able to innovate and experiment without sinking an ungodly amount of money into that experimentation, and if it doesn't work, then you lose your job, kind of thing. But not with smaller brewers, and that's why I think people who track the beer business are always astounded about, wow, there's more breweries opening up. How could that be? Well, there's plenty of room for more breweries to open up if you're small and you have a business model and a business plan that captures the really essence of local, and your business plan doesn't involve you to being a top 10 brewer in the country. You can do it.
In a day where there's no internet and it's illegal to homebrew, how do you get ingredients?
Oh, it was impossible. We didn't have good yeast and good hops, and we got reasonably good malt, but not a whole lot of diversity in our choices. The ingredients, you go to a homebrew shops were far and few between. They were usually called home winemaking shops because of the legalities. If you're a business, you could be busted and lose your business. If you're a homebrew, you get busted and they take your homebrew maybe. But that's not that big of a deal. But so that's why home brewing wasn't promoted, or it didn't really get into the mainstream, because businesses that were dealing with the ingredients and equipment were a little bit anxious about getting arrested because it was illegal, and that possibility existed.
When homebrewing was legalized on a federal level in 78 and you started the American Homebrewers Association, was that something that you felt coming, or was it like, oh, it's legal now on a federal level, someone needs to make a national association, why the hell not us? How did that happen?
Well, actually, I had started teaching beer making classes in 1973 through the Community Free School. So that was another thing that happened in those days. It wasn't just about, the revolution of home brewing. There was a lot of other stuff culturally and economically that was going on in the 70s. But we had the idea, my friend Charlie Papazian and I. Charlie took my class, and we had too many good home brews, and we back in about 1976, we had the idea of putting out a newsletter. And we said, well, if we do that, we're going to be taking people's money, and then we're going to have to deliver, and we're going to have to deliver on a regular basis. Do we really want to do this? And so we let that idea percolate for 2 or 3 years. And then in mid-1978, we said, let's go for it. And in December of 1978, we came out with the first magazine. We didn't have a clue that they were going to change the law until late that year, and that there was an article in the very first edition of the magazine. It wasn't a cover story or anything, but it started on the cover and it continued on the last page. But it was where we put it in at the final moment that we found out that it was going to be legalized. So we started the association, legal or illegal. We were going to do it.
Wow, what timing?
We knew that there were a lot of like-minded people out there, and we figured, well, maybe this is happening in other places in the country. And the way we reached out to other places in the country, you'll laugh at this. I don't think many people can relate to this, but we went to the library and got telephone books from all the major cities and looked in the yellow pages under home winemaking supplies and copied down addresses of home winemaking shops and then send them copies of the magazine. And that is how our first reach out outside of Colorado.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's actually really brilliant. Speaking of that, how did you even get into home brewing? You were teaching classes in '73, but you had to have at least learned a little bit before then.
I learned that it was possible because I had some, and I enjoyed some home brew when I was a college student in Charlottesville, Virginia, when I was going to the University of Virginia. And the old timer who was a Prohibition home brewer gave me a 3x5 card with the recipe on it. It was 5 lines and a few words, and that was my jumping off point. And from there, the first 2 batches went down the drain. They were so awful. Then we discovered a homebrew shop, and we bought our malt at the homebrew shop, and we got something called dried beer yeast, and we used the right kinds of sugars, and it improved enough that we enjoyed it, and other people liked it, and they wanted to learn how to make it. And so I became the teacher from what I basically knew. And then I started teaching, and then that's when it took off because I was learning from what other people were doing as well.
Yeah, teaching is a great way to learn.
Yeah, that's been my philosophy for a lot of different things. I've seen it happen with me. I mean, we experimented in those early classes, and we used all different grains, and there weren't any American books that really went into that at all. So it was just, let's do this, let's see what happens. Hey, it's good. It's not maybe better, but it's good. Or maybe this is great. So, there were all kinds of milestones that happened throughout those early years of American Homebrewers Association and Zymurgy. When the first few years, people won Best of Show with malt extract beers, and when the first all grain brewer won Best of Show, that was a milestone, and he became well known. He became a professional brewer in St. Louis, Blackstone Brewery, Dave Miller.
Wow.
When I use the analogy of a revolution, it's because, you could have created the American Homebrewing Association and it could have remained some small organization in Boulder. But it was that decision and that dedication to reach out to initially wine supply stores all across the United States, that what you guys were doing was actually building the network that enabled home brewing to really go national. It seems to me that you had a publication that was sharing the information with the entire country. And it didn't just happen by happenstance. That communication and that umbrella organization, it sounds like it was a lot of hard work. I mean, it's not the modern day where somebody discovers you on the internet. The whole idea that you are going to libraries and going through yellow pages after yellow pages all across the United States. I mean, that is a very grassroots, also very dedicated way to begin in empowering people all across the country to get together, to join clubs, create clubs, and start making better beer. I don't think that you can underestimate the importance of what you did with that organization and that magazine in those early years and in the years after. But I mean, the forethought and the tenacity to start that action, I think it's fantastic. I think it's incredible.
Well, you touched on a number of points, one of which is the whole idea of a social network. And in those days, the phrase social network really didn't exist. But beer was the basis of this social network that we created. Like you say, like I said, we reached out to homebrew shops, and they reached out to their customers, and their customers there were a few clubs here and there in Michigan and California and in Oregon, but they weren't communicating with each other. All of a sudden, there was this Zymurgy Magazine, and these crazy people in Boulder, Colorado, that that call themselves the American Homebrewers Association. That put off some people because by the very nature of home brewing, in those days, it was all about independence and who wanted to quote unquote belong. But we persisted, and the information we had was good. And the social network that we built, speaking in today's terms, was friendly in that if you look at the early issues of Zymurgy Magazine, we not only shared our successes, but we shared our failures and we laughed about them. And that really touched on everybody's experience. When have you seen a high profile expert type magazine touch on on not only the magazine's failures, but other people's failures and laugh at yourself? I mean, we were, it was about being yourself and developing confidence and learning by mistakes and being okay with that.
It's the best way to learn.
That resonated with people. And I think that's, it took us a while. I think it took us a full year and a half, maybe, before we got to 1,000 members. It was slow going. I wasn't going to quit. None of us were going to quit our day job. And most of the people that worked for us were volunteers on a part-time basis. But it was slow going. And you had to change people's psyche about home brewing, beer making. I can't do that. I've never done it. That's crazy. Do I want to be an outlier and make my own beer? Do I want to be made fun of? And so, it was this whole confidence building and saying, it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to share what you've done and accomplished and what your failures have been. And that really was kind of that's what really established the momentum in those early days.
And when we talk about your day job in those early days, is it correct that you had a nuclear engineering degree and you were teaching elementary school?
Yes, I have a degree. I still have a diploma on my wall in my office here. It says Bachelor of Science, Nuclear Engineering. Woo, boy.
I'm glad you chose beer.
But my day job, after 1970s, early 70s was a really tough time to get a job. We've been through some recent recession in the last 5 years, 6, 7 years. Nothing like the 70s. I mean, inflation was ridiculous. Interest rates at bank was 18 to 20%. You go out to get a loan. The economy was really down. Hard to find a job. I ended up getting the job that I wanted is in a preschool here in Boulder. I wanted to be a teacher for a while, because I enjoyed being around kids, and I learned that when I was in school. As I said, I was brewing beer in the basement of a preschool.
I love the mildly criminal romance of that.
So I interfaced with little kids. Not during school. I wasn't brewing beer during school time. But
to clarify, you were not teaching preschoolers how to brew.
But I go up there during the day to check on my beer every once in a while. And then I hang around kids, and the owner of the school was the guy who introduced us to the home brewer. So he was fundamental, and his attitude with kids and learning and I enjoyed that. So that's why I pursued doing that. And I ended up being a grade school teacher in this school for 8 years before I kind of cut those strings and I said, hey, I really enjoy what I'm doing with school, but I can't work 2 full-time jobs.
So in 78, the magazine starts. You become, AHA becomes sort of an umbrella organization that helps build this national community. It's also kind of a clearinghouse of information. And one of the interesting things that I think comes out of those early years is that the editor of Zymurgy actually coined the phrase microbrewery. Is that correct?
It was a small brewery news editor. His name was Stuart Harris, and he worked in the microcomputer industry, was just emerging in those days. So, and he was a volunteer, and he kind of kept up with the news about small brewery openings and closings. And he came, we were talking about, if you look at the first few articles that we wrote, the word microbreweries doesn't show up. We call them small breweries. And then he said, these small breweries are kind of like microcomputers, they're like microbreweries. And that's where the term came up.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of trivia, that what we called a PC before we called them PCs actually gave us the name microbrewery. I think that's a fun little piece of history.
And as a lot of people know, Steve Jobs was a member of the homebrew club in excuse me, that rarely rings. I heard everything else. That one rarely rings.
So you said Steve Jobs was a member of his local homebrew club?
Yeah. They call themselves the Homebrew Association or something in the LA area.
That's actually the second time that Steve Jobs has come up in our conversations. And it's interesting. You always have those like alternative histories for people, right? Like Castro really wanted to be a baseball player and he failed at that. And so he became a dictator instead. And, Fritz Maytag used to drink with Steve Jobs. And so, you taught him how to brew beer. Fritz used to drink with him. I wonder what the world would have been like if Jobs had been a better brewer and worse at tech. Maybe he would just be running a fantastic brewery somewhere on the West Coast, or I guess he would still be gone. But it's what he would have done.
So, in a couple years later, about a half decade, just under, the idea for the Great American Beer Festival came into existence. What was the reasoning behind this? Was it a pull from the Great British Beer Festival directly? Was it a unabashed cash grab like you see sometimes with beer festivals nowadays? Was it just a selfish thing? Like, I really want to try all the beers in this country. I'll make them come to me. What was the genesis for GABF?
Well, you touched on one of those was I would have chose one of those questions. 1981 was the year I went to the Great British Beer Festival, and I judged at the final round when they chose the best beers, and I got to know camera people. But what impressed me when I walked into the hall in Leeds, in England, and there were all these people drinking real ale and celebrating a beer culture, that blew me away. There was no precedent for that in the United States. And after a few pints, and I was staying with Michael Jackson, the beer author and writer, and over a pint nearby his home, I suggested the idea of, Michael, what do you think about the Great American Beer Festival in the United States? And he said, yeah, it'd be a great idea, but where are you going to get the beer? Because in 1981, there was not a whole lot of choice as far as commercially available beer. And like I said, there was no precedence. But I came home with the idea, and as home brewers, there was nothing to stop us. The idea, the seed of an idea really lit up the conversation, and there were four of us that kind of planned and schemed. And there was one brewer, the brewer at Boulder Beer, Tom Burns at the time. He was our connection with some professional brewers. There was Frank Morris, who was working for the local liquor store that featured a variety of beers. And he was our connection to the retailers and distributors. And there was myself, and there was Stuart Harris, the small brewery news editor, who had who was aware of what was going on out there. So we schemed, and again, there was no precedent. I mean, what our idea was to ask various American breweries to contribute beers to what we called the Great American Beer Festival, and have beer drinkers come and try a number of beers. And the nearest thing to that in those days was basically a kegger in the woods. That was the closest thing to a beer festival in those days. And the idea of beers being served from various breweries under one tent, under one roof, was revolutionary. And I was reminded of how revolutionary that was not too long ago when in Germany, when they have beer festivals, it's one brewery and their beers. They would never, ever, ever, ever dream of inviting or being involved in a festival in Germany until recently. It's changed, but until recently, they'd never want their beers served next to someone else's beers. And that was the case here in the United States back in the 80s. And I remember a gentleman who owned the Huber Brewing Company in Wisconsin. He was at the first Great American Beer Festival in 1982, and he was sitting there. His name was Fred Huber. And he was just sitting there with his hands on his forehead and shaking his head. He says, I never thought I'd live to see the day like this. These people are drinking beer. They're talking about beer, and all these beers from various breweries under one roof. There was never anything like it. So that was quite revolutionary.
It's really hard to grasp how different it was not even 40 years ago compared to today, where it's so commonplace that every city basically in the country is within 30 minutes of at least a handful of beer festivals any given year, pandemic aside. And back in 1982, it was literally blowing people's minds. It's these first 10 years of getting things going, to me, I feel like can be summed up with scheming curiosity, burning passion, and a why not attitude, and just getting it done. I mean, I love it. It's everything I admire in a person. And cheers to you.
We were getting it done, but were we making it work? That was sometimes in doubt. I mean, the beer festival probably didn't make money for 20 years. And, after the first 5 years, they were so difficult. There were things that we had to do that weren't quite, say, legal in order to get through it. I mean, we didn't sell enough tickets. We thought we would grow more than we did. We were lucky to break even. So looking back, everybody says, what a great idea. But in those days, there weren't a lot of people out there thinking it was a great idea. But there was core people, and they supported it. And, we struggled to continue the momentum. And then probably after about 10 years, we started getting momentum. And then it was about managing the operational and the logistics and the finances to figure out how to grow without going out of business.
How many breweries participated in that first year? Do you remember?
Yeah, about 20, 21 breweries and about 40 beers.
That's more than I would have expected, actually.
And there's only 3 or 4 microbreweries: Boulder Beer, Anchor, River City, and Sierra Nevada.
So you still had to rely a lot on big breweries for the participation.
Yeah, Coors sent Killian's Irish Red Ale. And when we went out to the regional breweries, all of them were making light lager. We didn't ask them to send their light lager. We didn't want that kind of a beer festival. We were able to figure out what beers to ask for, not because there was a book about beer, but there were books about beer labels. The collectors would publish label books, and we looked at the labels of what breweries like Stephen Points or Amana or Matt Brewing Company or Olympia, what they were brewing that was a little bit out of the ordinary. whether it was a porter or they called it an ale or a cream ale. I mean, we had to stretch it a little bit. Some of these were kind of like lagers in disguise, but at least they had character, or they had legendary following, and people were interested. We were able to find bock beers and stouts and porters and cream ales and various beers from some of those small breweries in those early days.
So after that, the next thing that you are legendary for is writing The Complete Joy of Homebrewing, which was first released in 83 or 84 and became the Bible for homebrewers. And I believe at this point that's sold over 1.3 million copies.
3 of those are mine.
Three of those are yours. And it's so, you've been hoarding some of them, Brett, but I love the fact that the book starts out with one page that says, warning, this book, if loaned, may never be returned. And there's a real truth to that. I mean, it's sold 1.3 million copies, which, number one, congratulations, that has to feel really cool. But secondly, that's a small fraction of the people that have actually read it, used it, learned from it, and become homebrewers or better homebrewers as a result. I mean, how does that feel?
Well, if it's still amazes me. I mean, the numbers is 1.3 million books that get shared and recycled through used bookstores. That's a lot more. I was doing my figuring back in those days. For every home brewer, there's probably going to be about 20 back in those days. I was saying, maybe there's 20 or 30 people that are going to taste that home brew. And you do the multipliers, and it was significant, and it was a confidence builder that we were onto something, and that things would grow, and people were aware of home brewing, and they were enjoying it. The first edition of that book was in the late 70s, and it was a book I self-published at a local printer, and it was the book that was used in my homebrew classes. And I printed a couple of thousand of those and got rid of them all through the class and through homebrew shops. But you're right, in 1984, the first big volume edition came out. It was really popular in bookstores. And it wasn't so immediately popular in home wine and beer making supply stores, because all the other books that were out there, and there weren't that many, but they were $1.50, $2.50, $3.50 at the most. That was an expensive book. It was usually $1 to $3. And, there was this feeling by homebrew shop owners that homebrewers were cheapskates, and they wouldn't spend that, $7.50 on my homebrew book. So they wouldn't carry it. But the thing that was different about American homebrewers, that was very different than what was happening in England and Canada, which set some precedents, was that the Canadians and the Brits were homebrewing because beer was so expensive, and they were cheapskates. They wanted cheaper beer. That was drove them. But in this country, people wanted better beer, and they were willing to make the investment in making it and in buying good ingredients and good supplies and good information. And people were buying them at the bookstore. And I remember that shopkeepers were telling me, well, I finally started carrying your book, Charlie, because they were buying your book at the bookstore, and they were coming in and they said they wanted to brew this recipe and that recipe. And it was quite obvious that your book was working. So they began selling in the homebrew shops.
The greatest lie ever told. Homebrewing is cheap. That is just not the case. Getting into it in college was a mistake I made, but one that paid off. It's interesting. I didn't know that about Canada and Britain, though. That's a really interesting dichotomy. And I've always only heard the one side of the story, where Americans are tired of the light lager, mass-produced swill that's being pushed on us constantly, and they're ready to spend money for something better. But I didn't realize that cheapskate generalization was actually rooted in some truth.
Yeah, the people who are manufacturing the malts and hops and yeast, their experience had been that you got to make things cheap, and it wasn't about the quality. And that really flipped the coin when Americans started making beer. They were interested in quality, and it's to this day they are. One of the things that I wanted to say earlier that I finally remembered was back in the 1970s, that was, like I said, the economy was really bad. Inflation was ridiculous. But there were other things that were happening. Air travel was deregulated, and it became affordable to travel abroad. And people were just beginning to travel abroad, and they come back with these stories and experiences of having great beer in another country, and why couldn't we make it here? That was one of the drivers. And when craft brewers and microbrewers began, they didn't have any idea of what was going to happen as far as the evolution of their business model. Because back in those days, imagine this: you're a microbrewer in the late 70s or early 80s, and you're selling your beer, and you're basically competing with the prices of imports and light lagers. And back in those days, the price of a keg of beer was about $30. Warp speed to what we're doing these days, and craft brewers are producing beer and selling it at a retailer for $600 to a couple of $1,000 a barrel. And that wasn't foreseen. Their business model was, we're going to have to charge a little more, but not the astronomical, the value proposition that we have these days. Now people are willing to spend on quality for a good beer. And
if anything, mass-produced beer has gotten cheaper with inflation, because $30 in 1970 is $200 a day, and that's about right in the pocket for a lot of craft brewers. Is $200 a half barrel is pretty standard anymore. So that's kind of nuts. How, if anything, how cheap beer has continued to get over time.
Yeah, though the premiums that craft brewers are getting for their special beers and their, call them extreme or hazy one-on editions. I mean, there are people whose business, you can be very small and make a living, not just survive and break even, but actually make a living.
Well, that's the beauty of it. Going back to what you said at the top of this interview, was that there is still plenty of room for the right business model for breweries in this country. There's still thousands of neighborhoods in bigger cities that can support breweries. There's still thousands of smaller cities across the country that could support a brewery. As long as you have the right expectations and the right management, you can make this work, and we can have a brewery in every city. It happens elsewhere.
So the term microbrewery gets coined back in the late 70s, and we used that for a long time. We've now kind of transitioned to the term craft brewery rather than microbrewery. And I think that, we've done that in part because we don't really know how to deal with the fact that a brewery like Sierra Nevada that started out in a garage in the early 80s is now a multi-billion-dollar company. How important to the experience and the ambiance of the beer and the quality of the beer, how important is the size of the brewery? I mean, what do you think gets lost when a brewery like Anchor Steam goes publicly traded?
Well, if it's done right and you're attending to all the details and you want to maintain the roots of from where you came from, it can work. But at the same time, losing a founder, losing your way, becoming bigger, you become a different kind of business. And it's difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult to maintain some of your core beliefs and core values that you had when you started. Some breweries have been able to do that. Many breweries have. Some have not. The cliche is, your connection to your community and being local, but it's really the connection to the people who drink your beer, and whether you want to share your values with them, and are they genuine values that you're communicating, and can people relate to your values? And that takes a lot of effort. I mean, that's a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of energy that needs to be put into that. And when breweries lose sight of how important that is, their beer culture in the company changes, and they become a different kind of company. And they can succeed business-wise, but do they have the same passions, the same feelings and concerns about their beer drinkers? Well,
So it's less about the size than it is your fidelity to the product and to your consumer and your philosophy as a business.
the size of the company doesn't necessarily dictate the fidelity with your customers, but the size of your company certainly dictates the kind of business you are and the concerns you have to have.
Your book, Microbrewed Adventures, a lupulin-filled journey to the heart and flavor of the world's great craft beers, a very long title and a very good book. But you start out talking about, this conference that you'd come from, and they had posed the question of why at that time, and I think we're talking about early 80s, that we had this concentration of microbreweries, of craft breweries, really good beer. They were almost all located on the West Coast. They were Colorado, Portland, California. And this question was posited to a speaker there. And your quote on what you thought about the speaker's answer, I absolutely loved. And the quote was that his answer was, "Academic bullshit things you say when you really don't know." But Brett and I have come up with a lot of our own bullshit theories on why that concentration was what it was. What do you think, looking back, was the answer? I mean, why do we have New Albion and Sierra Nevada? How much of it had to do with you and home brewing sort of emanating out from Colorado? How much of it had to do with the fact that you had these really driven, smart brewers like Jack McAuliffe and Fritz Maytag and Ken Grossman, all in a tight geographic area? I mean, is there an explanation for it?
In those days, I observed that it was rare and difficult for small brewers to succeed in large cities and densely populated and metropolitan areas. It seemed to be more, I wouldn't say rural, but a little bit more sparsely populated areas where, community was an identifying factor. People needed community in order to prosper and live where they did. And breweries fit into that because, as we discussed, breweries were the basis of an important social network. And people in rural communities needed that and had to pay attention. In cities, you had so many other things, so many other options. And there were a lot of breweries that just couldn't make it. And it was more expensive. And it was all about business in big cities, and it was about finances and business and making it as a small brewery. Yeah, there may have been a community of people that would have supported it, but the cost of doing business in a big city was just didn't work in those early days.
So those people that were seeking out a sense of community and where they lived overlapped with those people that were kind of part of the eat and drink local community, and all of that in craft brewing kind of went together.
Yeah, it did. There's this whole movement now about do things locally. I think craft brewers, microbrewers, call them what you want, were the harbingers of that idea. They were the first. eating local, growing local. I mean, you hear so much about that. We were preaching that back in the early 80s, but hardly anybody would listen. The thing is, the generation, that first generation of people came from an era which was a homogenized society. Velveeta cheese, Wonder Bread, instant coffee, you name it. I mean, that was cool. Frozen dinners. It was cool to be like everybody else.
Yeah.
And do the same thing and eat the same things. It was cool. And we grew up in that as kids and teenagers and young adults. And a lot of us said, we don't want that. We want real stuff. We want authenticism. We want personality. We want differentiation. We want a little bit of diversity. And it was brewers that really they had to embrace that. And slowly the mass culture embraced it. And that went hand in hand along with the growth of craft breweries. I mean, there were so many other things that people began to reflect on, enjoy, and willing to pay more money for, because they finally saw the value of needing to pay more money for what they really wanted out of life.
Makes sense.
Did I answer the question? I don't know.
No, that was great. That was fantastic. Charlie, thank you so much for your time. I only got two more things for you, if you're willing.
Sure.
First is the very derivative question. What do you think of seltzer right now?
Oh boy. Well, there are people that enjoy it, that's for sure. But I don't know if it's the beer drinker that's enjoying it.
Yep. Yeah. Well said. That sums it up.
I miss the classic beer styles. That where I get annoyed when I go into a pub or a brew pub and there's all these hazy IPAs and seltzers, and I can't find a hoppy lager or a porter or a stout or English ale or even American pale ale. I mean, it's just like, it's going to come around, but it will. But I'm hearing more and more from people that they're over IPAs or they're over this, and they're drinking. They might be drinking seltzers because they don't, they can't get their porters and their stouts and their pale ales and their beers that are, less than 6%. We've grown up and we're drinking, a little less alcohol. We're not drinking non-alcohol. We're just drinking less alcohol. And I think that tier of beer drinkers is being forgotten.
Yeah, I agree.
I'll be a happy brewer if I never have to drink an under-attenuated, sweet, hazy IPA again. I'm just so over that.
I mean, I enjoy some hazy IPAs. Maybe that's why they have so many out there, because they're so different, and there's always somebody who like it. But
that's true.
I don't like them all.
That's very true.
I don't like them all.
The only other thing I wanted to tell you, which I don't know how you're even going to respond or can respond to this, but we have a brewer here at Urban Artifact who you're his idol, and it's his literal career dream to one day be able to get a fist bump from you on the GABF stage. So as long as you're still handing out awards, we're going to try our damnedest to get him up on that stage in the coming years. So I just wanted to share with you so I could tell him I told you.
Well, if I'm not handing out the awards, I'll be glad to rendezvous anywhere you want.
Well, I'm gonna hold you to that. Thank you again, Charlie. Really appreciate talking to you. Really appreciate everything you've done. This has been an amazing conversation. I couldn't have been more pleased and excited. And just cheers to you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for everything you did for the industry. That was a great interview, and I can't wait to break it down. But before we do that, let's hear a word from the people that help make this podcast happen. And that actually includes you out there listening. So don't forget to like and subscribe, because it does matter. Thanks.
This podcast was brought to you in part by Beechwood Audio. Beechwood Audio provides sound acquisition, post, and design services for individual, corporate, and commercial clients. For more information, contact Adam at soundfilmvideo.com.
Mike, I think what we learned today was that this is the story of the reluctant hero. The story of a person who was faced with a challenge brought about by their own curiosity and pleasures and passions. But when faced with that challenge, and every challenge that came thereafter, continued to say, yes, I will get this done. Yes, I will start a homebrewing magazine because I know my friends want to learn more about brewing, even though it's still illegal. Yes, I will start American Homebrewers Association to teach people across the country because I know people want to learn more. Yes, I will start a great craft beer festival in America because I went to Britain and I learned how awesome those can be. Yes, I will start the Brewers Association Guild because I want American craft beer to be successful. This person is someone who didn't set out to change an entire industry, but they did.
He brought up the word disruptors. And today, that's one of the things that we talk about, right? I mean, first you become an influencer, and then you buy a turtleneck and become a disruptor. And, he wasn't an influencer, he wasn't a disruptor, although he was both of those things in spades, as we would use those terms today. He was just less douchey about it. I mean, he saw a need to do something, and he did it. And then he did more of it, and he did more of it, and he did more of it. And in the process, the guy absolutely transformed how we drink beer in the United States. And there's not a statue to him, and he's not out there with a cult following. I mean, he's got his own kind of natural, organic cult following, I guess, but he didn't make a big deal out of the fact. He still doesn't. You talk to him today, it was an astoundingly humble conversation for a guy that transformed how an entire country thinks about beer.
You're right. And that, I think, is something that maybe it just feels like we need more of in this country right now, or maybe it just feels like that's an uncommon thing. But for somebody to come in and be presented with a challenge and step up to the plate repeatedly and keep hitting home runs and then just keep getting stuff done.
Not because it was easy.
No. And not because they wanted the fame or credit or anything. They were fine. Charlie's fine just shrugging off all of these accomplishments he's had because he lived a good life. He's happy. He made great beer. And he relaxed. He didn't worry, and he enjoyed some homebrew.
Starts out as a bored nuclear engineer who just doesn't want to drink shitty beer. And then in the process, founds a revolution. That's crazy, man.
It's the altruism that's involved, just wanting to teach other people how to homebrew.
Yeah.
Which comes from his a little bit of teaching background, and he just wants to share his joy.
The guy is maybe above all a teacher. That seems to have been his first passion, and he seems to have been spectacular at it. He was great at it when he taught preschool, and he was even better at it when he started teaching beer. Maybe not even better at it. It's just that, if he taught really good preschool, who gives a fuck?
Well, it's not like the students can sing your praises in preschool.
Right.
Well, what do you go home from preschool with besides a shitty drawing? At least with homebrewing, you come home and you can get drunk.
Yeah. But, yeah, I mean, the guy, that teaching aspect, that's really what he did ultimately. When you look from beginning to end, he taught America how to drink.
He taught America how to appreciate drink. He didn't teach us how to drink. He taught us what to appreciate, what's worth drinking.
Yeah.
And I'll be damned,
that's huge.
We were in the dark before that happened.
Yeah. I assumed American Homebrewing Association and Zymurgy started in 1978 because that's when craft beer was legal, or homebrewing was legalized in 1978. And it was really amazing for me to learn that they didn't start those things because homebrewing became legal. It was just coincidental. Like, they were going to do it anyway. They were going to start this publication to explain on a national level how to do something that was federally criminal at the time.
Like, laws be damned. I'm doing what I'm doing, and I want to teach these people and support this movement.
It's time that we start making better beer and just have at it.
Who gives a shit if we're not supposed to make it in our basement? Oh
some
no, I
dumb
accidentally
laws.
mixed this malt with some water and it made beer. So arrest me.
Right. Which is also, I think it's funny that both Fritz Maytag and Charlie Papazian thought of at least the concept of being arrested as a good PR move.
Yeah, you're right. Let's just drive around with these hops in our seat next to us and see if someone pulls us over.
Yeah. Let's do a national publication of how to do some illegal shit. See how that works out for us.
Now, see, if only when I got arrested those 3 times, I got more press for Urban Artifact, things would be a lot different.
Yeah. I don't think my arrests have been. I would rather they just be expunged. One of the things that Charlie said that I thought was interesting is that there is an infinite amount of space in the United States for people who want to brew and sell their own beer, as long as you're not all trying to become one of the top 10 largest brewers in the United States. And it's a very interesting thing that you and I talk about at times, that we're headed into this period where, oddly, we have more breweries than we ever have had, but we also seem to have less of a diversity of beers.
A sea of sameness, if you will.
A sea of sameness. And it seems counterintuitive that the more breweries we have gotten in the past, at least 5 years in particular, the more same the beer seems to be, the less creative it seems to be. And that's really, where Charlie starts back in the 70s is, let's see what kind of weird shit we can toss into a vat and what kind of interesting beer we can make from it. There was this just like massive experimentation of individuality and really creative beers. And now that we're in this massive explosion of craft breweries, we seem to be seeing a restriction in styles. And I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, what the fuck? Is the problem there that everybody is trying to be the top 10, that everybody's starting a brewery now, wants to figure out how to, to become Budweiser?
That reminds me of the old saying, a brewery is creative, but breweries don't have any ability to create anything new.
Fair enough.
And, I don't know. I kind of disagree on a fundamental level with the infinite thing. First of all, if you just think about it logically, we can't have an infinite number of anything because then that's all we're going to have. But the issue that comes about is when each brewery looks to every other brewery for direction on what they should do rather than looking to themselves or to their customers. That to me is the problem. We don't need another brewery making the same thing as every other brewery. We got that already. If you really look at it, all of a sudden now we're going down a capitalist wormhole. So why would I even try to be creative when I know this sells? Yeah. And I'm not going to risk my house because that's what SBA loans you have to put up. The government's like, oh, we'll give you money to start a business, but we'll also take your fucking house if you fail, you dumb little poor twat.
Yeah.
So why would you do anything that's creative when it's all risk?
And the amount of capital that it takes to start a brewery, just in the last 10 years, has changed dramatically.
Oh, yeah.
So you see these guys, you see Jack McAuliffe starting out with $5,000 back in 76. You see Papazian teaching people how to homebrew in their kitchen to save money in large part. But what they're doing is really creative. It is an art. It is the craft in what becomes what we call craft brewing. And yeah, it became popular enough that I think we're losing the craft to the search for where it is monetary. The search for how do I make money from brewing beer rather than how do I brew beer that I love and get paid for it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we're losing the craft. It's just harder to find.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, too.
Yeah, it's still out there. I mean, there's still definitely a lot of people in the industry that are driven by the passion to make great beer.
And the issue, too, as a consumer is are you looking for craft beer? And if you are, everything's so currently crafted to be hidden.
Right.
And you not know what's independent, not know what's truly craft versus mass market. And I mean, if you don't know anything about gold or jewelry, and I throw down a bunch of gold-looking rings in front of you, can you tell me which one's 24 karat gold versus 10 versus pyrite? No. unless you're a jeweler. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be. Don't have to be a brewer to drink craft beer in this country. But you almost, to understand it, you do. And I don't understand where we've gotten off topic this much at this point in time. But
that's what we do. That's what we do, man. I mean, drink and meander.
The point is that we wouldn't even be having these philosophical beer conversations if it wasn't for Charlie laying the foundations in the first place.
Yeah.
If he didn't look at American craft beer and be like, what is this light lager crap? And look at these other countries and be like, why don't we
do better?
Why don't we have good tasting things here?
We're America, goddammit.
And now
we can make real beer here.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And we do, and we can. And I think that we're still arguably probably making the best beer in the world here in the United States.
Don't disagree on
But
that.
although I have had some extraordinary beers in Canada, but
I've had some good in Italy. Belgians, of course.
Yeah.
Let's just name every country.
Right.
Japan, China,
France
Russia,
beers is mediocre.
Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine.
Russian beers suck balls.
Finland, other Dutch countries, Spain, Portugal. Well, Mike, like the end of any good happy hour, it only leads to a late night happy hour. So on that note, let's get our asses out of the studio, into the bar.
To the bar.
And fill our glasses up once more.
To the bar.
To the bar. Cheers.
Prost.
The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is a production of Brew Skies Limited in association with 779, a leading video production and content creation agency. With over a decade of experience, 779 works with a wide range of clients, from global brands to boutique startups to mom-and-pop shops. Visit 779video.com for more information. That's the numbers 779video.com. This episode was edited by Dan Fennessy, who is also our executive producer. This podcast was engineered by Adam Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.